A black pilot steps into the airline headquarters on what should have been the proudest day of her life, her first official flight as senior captain. But within minutes, everything unravels. She's told to wait outside with no explanation. Then, humiliated in front of her crew, she's pulled from her own flight. What happens next? It doesn't just expose a single act of discrimination, it brings an entire billion-dollar airline to its knees. What she uncovered behind closed doors shocked the FAA, shut down flights nationwide, and ignited a movement that changed aviation forever. Stay with me because this is more than a story. It's a wake-up call. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if this story moves you like it moved us, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because the truth deserves to fly. At 5:17 in the morning, under the heavy breath of a winter fog blanketing O'Hare's tarmac, Maya Daniels walked like a woman who knew exactly who she was until the world dared to remind her otherwise. Her steps were steady, measured, the quiet click of her polished black shoes on the smooth floor echoing in the vast terminal like a metronome counting down to something she couldn't yet name. She moved through the airport like a memory that refused to fade, a woman who had flown across continents, danced with turbulence over the Himalayas, and once landed a Su-130 blind through a dust storm in Kandahar. At 37, she carried 15,000 hours of flight time, and every second of it was stitched into her spine. Her uniform was spotless. The 4 gold stripes on her sleeve caught the terminal's fluorescent light like medals whispering, "Earned, not given." And today was no ordinary day. Today was the culmination of a journey paved by grit and grace. It was her first morning flying as senior captain for Meridian Airlines. She reached the crew lounge, the door opening with a hiss and a blast of warm air mixed with the smell of fresh coffee and pre-flight adrenaline. Pilots and flight attendants milled about, reviewing routes and scrolling through phones. Conversations paused. Heads turned. The momentary shift was subtle, like wind changing direction. But Maya noticed. She always noticed. Being one of the few black women in a sea of navy blazers and aviation pins meant you had to. But she didn't flinch. She offered a polite smile, walked to the coffee pot, poured herself a cup, and stirred in a splash of cream. In the mirrored surface of the pot, she caught her own reflection, a calm face framed by natural curls tucked neatly under her cap. Behind her, a voice called out, deep and smooth like a well-rehearsed script, "You must be Captain Daniels." She turned. Salt and pepper hair. Same stripes. A handshake extended with just enough smile to suggest it was practiced, not heartfelt. "Captain Richard Whitmore," he said. "I'll be your check captain for the next few weeks." Maya accepted the handshake with the firm, steady grip her father taught her. "Pleased to fly with you," she said. He nodded. Briefing room C. Crews waiting. As he walked away, Maya felt it, not fear, not exactly, but a knot, like a storm cloud gathering in the gut. Because she had met this kind of man before. The kind who smiled at you while tallying your shortcomings in invisible ink. The kind who made you prove yourself twice just to get half as far. But she remembered her father's voice, low and unshakable like gospel. "Maya, you'll have to be twice as good to get half as far. And you do it anyway." That wasn't just advice, it was instruction for survival. So she walked into that briefing room with her back straight and her documents ready. She was prepared for turbulence, but she didn't expect the wind shear. Not like this, not from within. The operations director entered, stiff and dismissive. "Change of plans," he said. "Captain Whitmore will take the flight today. Captain Daniels, we need you to wait outside." Just like that. No explanation. No discussion. 7 words that snapped through the air like ice cracking beneath thin boots. She stood there, all eyes turning to her, and the silence in the room was louder than any jet engine. If you're over 65 and reading this, maybe you've lived through your own version of that moment, the promotion denied, the door closed, the seat at the table quietly removed. Maybe you know what it means to hold your head high in a room that questions your worth without saying a word. And here's what I say to you, don't flinch. Don't fold. Because that's the moment the story starts, not when the door opens, but when it slams shut and you decide to stay standing anyway. We don't grow stronger by being welcomed, we grow stronger by refusing to be erased. So whatever room they ask you to wait outside of, you hold your ground. And when your name is called, or even if it's not, you walk back in with everything you've earned and everything they didn't see coming. Because the sky doesn't ask who you are before it holds your plane aloft. It only asks, can you fly? And Maya Daniels, like so many of us who've had to wait outside too long, was ready to fly not despite the shut door but because of it. The hallway outside briefing room C was long and cold, humming faintly with fluorescent lights that flickered every so often like they too were tired of pretending. Maya stood there with her back against the wall, her flight binder still in hand, her coffee cooling in its cup. The silence pressed on her like altitude, thin and heavy at the same time. 10 minutes passed. Maybe more. It's funny how time stretches when your dignity is left dangling between someone else's assumptions and your own restraint. She had been in war zones with clearer rules of engagement. But this was the quiet battle, a war waged not with weapons, but with doubt, with silence, with the subtle cutting of competence dressed in a smile. And if you've ever been left out of a room you were qualified to enter, you know that it's not the exclusion that hurts the most, it's the idea that someone believes you'll accept it quietly. The door finally opened, and it wasn't the operations director or the check captain who emerged. It was James Chun, her co-pilot for the scheduled flight, a young Asian-American officer with a quick mind and a steady hand. He looked at her with a kind of apology in his eyes, the kind of look men give when they recognize injustice but don't have the seniority or maybe the safety to name it aloud. He leaned in and said quietly, "They said it's standard. But I've seen 4 new captains start since I got here. None of them were pulled from their first flight." He didn't have to say more. The message was clear. This wasn't about policy. This was about precedent and who gets to set it. Maya nodded, not in acceptance, but in acknowledgement of the deeper current running beneath the polished glass and polite conversation. Then came the reassignment. Flight 422 to Seattle, not as captain, but as an observer. And not with just any captain, but with Harold Wilson, the oldest, most venerated flyer in the fleet, and by some accounts, the loudest opponent of diversity on the Meridian roster. The name hit her like sudden turbulence. She had never met him, but she had heard enough in break rooms and whispered warnings to know what to expect. He was known for flying by the book and judging by the cover. And in Maya's case, the cover was her uniform wrapped around skin he believed didn't belong in the captain's seat. Still, she agreed to go. Not because she accepted the reasoning, but because she understood the terrain. Sometimes you don't climb by kicking the door down. Sometimes you walk through every room they try to humiliate you in and memorize the exits for later. She met Wilson on the tarmac, and he greeted her with a nod that felt more like a closing gate than a welcome. During the flight, he barely acknowledged her existence except when correcting himself aloud for her benefit, calling out every checklist item as though teaching a child, not addressing a peer. And yet, when he dialed the wrong frequency for Seattle approach and she gently corrected him, he stiffened, checked his chart, and muttered a grudging thanks without ever looking her in the eye. That was the moment. Not when she caught the mistake. Not even when he admitted it. But in the silence that followed, where he realized she knew the job better than he had assumed. You see, the fight against prejudice isn't always loud. It's in the small, exact moments where excellence exposes expectation as ignorance. And for those of you who have lived long enough to watch a world change slower than it should, you know this truth well. Sometimes the most radical act is showing up, staying sharp, and refusing to shrink. So here's what Maya knew in that jump seat, and here's what I ask you to remember today when they sideline you, when they question your value, when they reroute your purpose. Don't just take notes. Take names. Study every pattern, every face, every turn of phrase they use to hold you back. Because that's how you prepare not just to resist, but to rewrite the entire system. The pilot's seat may be at the front of the plane, but the power doesn't only come from the cockpit, it comes from the clarity you carry with you, even when they ask you to sit behind the controls and watch. Maya didn't just fly. She observed. She listened. And she began building a case not only against the men who doubted her, but against the culture that enabled their confidence. So if you ever find yourself reassigned, or overlooked, or told to wait while someone else takes your place, don't retreat. Pay attention. Because one day you'll need every detail. And when the time comes, you won't be waiting outside the room. You'll be the one deciding who gets in. The flight to Seattle was short, barely 2 hours from wheels up to touchdown, but to Maya Daniels, it felt like a slow crawl through a storm of calculated silence. Captain Harold Wilson, with his graying temples and iron perfection, didn't speak to her unless it was to narrate procedure like a weary schoolteacher forced to repeat a lesson to someone who didn't deserve to be in the classroom. His voice, clipped and cold, explained every toggle and check as if she hadn't logged over 15,000 hours herself, as if the 4 stripes on her sleeve were made of paper and not earned through years of sweat, war zones, and airspace most pilots never saw. Maya sat in the jump seat, back straight, eyes sharp, absorbing every detail not just of the flight, but of the man beside her. He flew well, she'd give him that. Clean transitions, tight on the trim, methodical. But methodical isn't the same as wise. Wisdom is knowing that a system only works when it welcomes excellence in every form it comes in, regardless of gender, complexion, or the history stitched into the hem of a uniform. Wilson lacked that wisdom. He carried tradition like a shield, but never once asked himself who tradition had protected and who it had excluded. As the 737 descended into SeaTac, a ripple of tension moved through the cockpit. Wilson dialed the wrong approach frequency, and Maya caught it. "Captain, I believe Seattle approach is on 28.35 today, not 124.75, she said, gently but firmly, her voice neither hesitant nor confrontational. The cockpit went quiet. She could see his hand hesitate on the dial. He checked the chart, adjusted the frequency, and muttered, "That's correct. Thank you, Captain Daniels." No eye contact, no smile, just a concession forced by facts. That moment, quiet and passing, was everything, because in it, Maya didn't just correct a mistake, she shattered the illusion that she didn't belong. And here's the lesson. When you're doubted, let your excellence speak before your ego does. Make them see what they tried to overlook. And if they still don't see it, that's on them, not on you. After landing, as they taxied toward the gate, Wilson surprised her. "You have a good eye," he said, still looking straight ahead. "Most wouldn't have caught that." Maya nodded, offering no more than a quiet, "Thank you, sir," because some compliments come coated in surprise, and they reveal more about the speaker's expectations than the subject's skill. But what followed cut deeper. "Don't misunderstand," he added. "One good catch doesn't make you Meridian material. This airline has standards, traditions. Not everyone fits." Maya stared straight ahead, her jaw tightening, but her reply was steady, her voice low and resolute. "With respect, Captain, traditions evolve. They have to." He turned to her then, finally, his pale blue eyes sharp and cold. "Not at Meridian," he said, and in that moment, Maya understood she wasn't just navigating airspace. She was navigating an institution engineered to resist her presence. A cockpit is a place of precision, but a culture like Meridian's? That was a machine designed to protect sameness, not to elevate excellence. And if you've ever tried to change a place that doesn't want to change, you know what Maya felt in that moment. Clarity. Not anger, not sadness, just the solid click of truth locking into place. Over the next few days, she was bounced from one captain to another like luggage in a storm, each flight a new test, a new layer of condescension wrapped in procedure. These weren't assignments. They were deterrents. Hazing in the quiet, corporate kind of way. Minimal rest, maximum scrutiny, and enough passive aggression to fill a cargo hold. But she didn't crack. Because some of us were forged, not hired. Some of us had to learn long ago how to hold our breath through the storm and speak clearly once we reached cruising altitude. If you're reading this and you've ever been the first or the only in a space designed without you in mind, let Maya's story remind you. You are not a guest in a room you earned the right to enter. You're a key in a lock they hoped would never turn. So turn it. Don't shrink for their comfort. Don't soften your brilliance to fit their narrow beams. Fly the route. Note the turbulence. And when the time comes, rear out the whole damn system. Maya Daniels didn't come to Meridian to beg for space, she came to chart a course. And the men who thought she'd break under pressure hadn't understood one thing. She wasn't made of glass. She was made of wings. That evening, long after the roar of jet engines had faded and the terminal lights dimmed to a low hum, Maya sat alone in her new apartment with a glass of Cabernet in her hand and a storm gathering behind her eyes. The space was sparse, no framed pictures yet. No books on the shelves, but it was hers, and it was quiet, and that was enough. Her body ached from days of flying under scrutiny, of smiling through slights, of listening to men explain procedures she'd mastered years ago as though she'd just stepped out of a simulator. But the real weight wasn't in her shoulders or her spine, it was in the silence that surrounded her when the door clicked shut, and she was no longer performing resilience for the world. That's the part no one tells you about being a groundbreaker. The applause fades fast, but the loneliness lingers. Still, Maya didn't cry. She didn't rant. She did what her father taught her to do when the world tried to twist her into a shape that fit someone else's comfort. She researched. She opened her laptop and started with the company she had just spent weeks trying to fit into, Airlines. On the surface, it gleamed, founded in 1967, a record of steady growth, a brand wrapped in red, white, and the illusion of integrity. But scratch the paint and the rust showed. Their executive board? All white. Only 2 women. No people of color in upper management. Employee reviews whispered truths HR departments tried to bury. An old boys club, paper-thin diversity efforts, and an environment where speaking up came with a price tag. Maya clicked through page after page, screenshot after screenshot, and what began as curiosity turned into clarity. It wasn't just about her. This wasn't a personal conflict, it was a pattern. And once you recognize a pattern, you can no longer pretend it's an exception. She found lawsuits, 3 in the last 10 years, all discrimination-related, all settled quietly behind closed doors with non-disclosure agreements stitched shut with hush money. She paused when she reached an article from 8 months ago, Airlines under FAA scrutiny for maintenance log discrepancies. The language was careful, as corporate speak always is, but the message was clear. Something wasn't right beneath the polished exteriors and smiling gate agents. She bookmarked the article and stared at it for a long time, as if waiting for it to blink first. If you're someone who's ever worked in a system you suspected was rotten but felt powerless to name it, this is your page in the story. And I say this to you now, especially if you've spent decades watching institutions shift just enough to quiet critics but not enough to share power. The time to remain polite is over. Be curious. Be thorough. Be relentless. Dig. Name. Illuminate. The truth doesn't rot in daylight, it reforms. The next morning, Maya reported to a new captain. This one was different. Andrew Peterson, cordial, polite, but cautious, like a man trying not to trip over the eggshells someone else left. Mid-flight, he leaned over and said, "For what it's worth, not all of us agree with how you're being treated." Maya didn't smile. She'd heard those words before. "But you're not speaking up either." He looked away, embarrassed, and that was answer enough. He warned her quietly, "Watch out for Barrett and Wilson. They've been untouchable for years." The words hung in the cockpit like smoke. Later, between flights, she introduced herself to the ground crew under the guise of wanting to learn company procedures. Most were polite but distant, until she met Marcus Jefferson, a maintenance technician with grease-stained hands and Detroit in his voice. They laughed over shared hometown streets, and for a moment, Maya felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Belonging. But Marcus's tone changed when she asked about the FAA review. "They're rushing us," he said, eyes darting toward the hangar entrance. "Used to be things got checked twice. Now it's once, if that. They're pushing birds out the gate faster than we can keep up." Maya felt the chill crawl up her spine. "Is that legal?" Marcus gave a half shrug, half grimace. "It's in a gray area, but I wouldn't put my own family on some of these planes." Before she could ask more, a supervisor appeared and the conversation ended. But the seed had been planted. And if you're someone who's ever seen a truth too dangerous to ignore but too costly to name, you know what Maya knew in that moment. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as it was designed to protect profit, not people. And if you're still breathing, still thinking, still able to act, then you're not powerless. You're positioned. So pay attention. Take notes. Build the file. Because the change we need won't come from the top down, it will come from the quiet determination of those who refuse to look away. Maya Daniels wasn't just collecting data. She was building a fuse. And one day it was going to blow. The call came at 4:30 a.m. Not a scream through the phone. Not even a voice, it was a vibration. A quiet buzz on the nightstand, like the future nudging Maya gently awake. She blinked into the dark, her body still aching from yesterday's flight, her mind already rehearsing today's protocol. It was James Chin. The message was brief. Assigned to Vegas Red Eye. You're finally in the left seat. Maya stared at it for a long beat, her breath catching. The cockpit was hers on paper, but she knew enough by now to read between the lines. A red eye, least desirable, least visible, often overlooked by passengers and management alike. Test, not a promotion. But still, a cockpit is a cockpit. And some fights you take with gratitude, not because you're lucky, but because you're ready. She packed light documents, checklists, extra copies of flight protocols she knew by heart. And tucked in her jacket pocket, a small folder of maintenance irregularities she'd gathered over weeks. No accusations, just observations, just the truth. When she arrived at the gate, the sky outside was still black, its silence broken only by the orange glow of runway lights blinking like tired eyes. James was already waiting, nodding with the kind of smile that says, I see what they're doing. I've got your back anyway. Pre-flight checks began like always. But something snagged her attention, a maintenance log that didn't line up. Dates off by days. Valve inspections marked as deferred without notation. Maya ran her fingers over the clipboard like a pianist finding a wrong note. This wasn't a gut feeling. This was an off-key alarm. She looked at the ground crew and asked, calmly, for clarification. A shrug, a nod, a reassured, it's all within parameters, Captain. But she'd heard that line before too many times. So she delayed the flight. 20 minutes. A sin in the gospel of airline efficiency. You sure that's necessary? James whispered, trying to walk the line between support and self-preservation. Better 20 minutes late than never arriving, she replied, steady. The inspection cleared the plane, but not her conscience. She filed a report, precise and clinical, like all good whistleblowers do. And then she flew flawlessly. But she knew what was coming. You don't call out the cracks in the wall without someone trying to seal you inside it. The next morning, the summons arrived. A meeting with Thomas Barrett. Maya entered the executive office like a soldier walks into an ambush, ready, but unwilling to draw first blood. He didn't bother with small talk. You delayed flight 889. That cost the company thousands. His tone wasn't anger, it was offense. Like a man upset that someone stepped out of place. Maya's voice didn't waver. The log was inconsistent. That violates FAA protocol. Barrett's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening like a vice. You overruled trained ground staff on a feeling? On evidence, she corrected. The intake valve service date didn't align with the records. He leaned forward, hands clasped, his voice cold and clipped. If you can't trust our systems, Captain Daniels, maybe Meridian isn't the right fit. And there it was, the dare. To back down. To nod. To absorb the quiet threat and retreat into compliance. But Maya wasn't built to bow. She smiled, polite and lethal. Would you mind putting that in writing, Mr. Barrett? The color drained from his face, not because he feared her, but because he feared documentation. The real power doesn't lie in the confrontation, it lies in the record. In the receipt. And here's what you need to remember, especially if you've lived long enough to know how the game works. The most dangerous person in a broken system is the one who knows the rules better than the people enforcing them. So take notes. Keep records. Don't fight with noise, fight with facts. The flight logs, the inconsistencies, the testimonies. Maya was building something bigger than an HR complaint. She was building a mirror. And one day, she was going to hold it up to Meridian and say, look, this is who you are. And the world is watching now. That night, alone again, the hum of the fridge and the ticking of the wall clock her only companions. She spread the papers out across the kitchen table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle made of truth. And piece by piece, the picture came into view. A culture of shortcuts, silenced voices, and systemic neglect hidden beneath layers of branding and PR polish. If you've ever found yourself wondering whether it's worth it, whether speaking up makes a difference, let Maya's quiet resolve remind you. Change doesn't begin with the whole system collapsing. It begins with one person refusing to pretend everything is fine. It begins with your voice, your file, your insistence on naming what others won't. The plane flew. The passengers never knew. But that night, one woman filed a report that would one day ground an empire. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she believed that flying is a sacred trust and the sky never forgives lies. There is a strange kind of calm that settles over a person the moment they realize the worst has already begun, when the storm isn't coming, but already here, and you're standing in the middle of it with no umbrella, no shelter, just your bare skin and your name. For Maya Daniels, that calm came the morning after she refused to back down in Barrett's office. She sat at her kitchen table in a city that still felt more like a terminal than a home, surrounded by the quiet rustling of papers, email printouts, technical reports, and a long mental list of names and faces that had either helped her or hurt her or simply stood silent while harm was done. There were no violins playing in the background, no swelling music. Just her heartbeat and the low hum of traffic drifting up from the street. That day, she moved through the airline's headquarters like a shadow that wouldn't vanish. She did what she was told, submitted to the sudden administrative reassignment, answered emails, filled out meaningless forms designed not to gather insight, but to keep her hands busy and her mouth closed. She was watched security at the corners of hallways, IT reps suddenly checking the workstation assigned to her. The message wasn't subtle. They knew, or at least they suspected. And if you've ever lived long enough to know how fear behaves when it's dressed in a suit and tie, then you know how systems move not in panic, but in preparation. They weren't scared of what she knew. They were scared of what she might do with it. Her phone buzzed more than usual that day. First it was James. "This is wrong. Let me know how I can help." Then Marcus. "Meet me at Bay 34. For 30. Important." But the one that surprised her came from Peter Lawson, the quiet first officer from her Seattle flight. "Not all of us are like them. Some of us remember why we started flying." That sentence stuck to her ribs like a meal you didn't know you were hungry for. And maybe that's the truth. For a lot of us, we forget what we started for. We forget the fire that once pulled us forward and settle for keeping our heads low and our paychecks regular. But Maya couldn't afford that kind of forgetting anymore. At 4:30 sharp, she met Marcus in the maintenance hangar. The air was heavy with oil and turbine dust, the scent of sweat and integrity still clinging to the uniforms of men who kept birds in the sky but were never invited to board them. Marcus looked around before speaking, eyes scanning for ears that might be listening. "They're falsifying records," he said. No preamble, no hesitation. Downgrading serious issues so planes stay in rotation. They say it's legal, but it's not. And it sure as hell ain't safe. Maya said nothing, just listened, because sometimes silence is the most radical form of attention. "You didn't hear this from me?" he added, slipping a USB drive into her hand. "But if something happens, I couldn't live with it." She didn't promise him anything, not because she was unsure, but because promises are currency, and she was saving every ounce of hers for the fight ahead. That night, she sat again at her table. Only this time she wasn't just holding papers. She was holding patterns. She was holding proof. You see, most people think revolutions start with shouting. But the real ones, they start in silence. In files, in folders, in emails flagged and forwarded and copied twice. In the quiet courage of those who collect the receipts while smiling through meetings. If you are older, if you have spent years watching institutions protect themselves instead of the people who built them, you already know this truth. The only way to fix the engine is to stop pretending it's not smoking. So I ask you now, what files are you sitting on? What truths have you tucked into your memory like contraband in a hostile system? Pull them out. Blow the dust off. Because change doesn't begin when people get angry, it begins when people get clear. Maya didn't sleep much that night. Instead, she created a map not on paper but in her mind. A map of conversations, names, actions, and omissions. A web of silence and complicity. And at the center of it wasn't just Barrett or Wilson, it was a culture that had convinced itself it was too big to be questioned. But no system is too big for accountability. No company too powerful for the truth. And no woman too small to demand it. So if you've lived your life thinking someone else will blow the whistle, someone else will call it out. Someone younger, louder, braver, let this be your reminder. You are someone. And it's never too late to shake the table. Maya Daniels wasn't finished flying. She was just now starting to land where it counted. The sky was still dark when Maya stepped into the crew lounge for her red-eye to Las Vegas. But inside her, a new kind of light had turned on, clear, cold, and unwavering. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't afraid. She was focused. The kind of focus that comes after you've been underestimated one too many times, after you've stopped waiting for permission to do what you already know is right. James was there, flight folder in hand, giving her a quiet nod, the kind shared between people who've seen too much to speak it out loud. This flight wasn't just another trip through cloud layers and time zones. This was her first time officially assigned as captain since her reassignment weeks ago. But the placement wasn't a gift, it was a trap. A red-eye with tired passengers, a skeleton ground crew, and just enough turbulence on the forecast to set her up for failure. But Maya Daniels didn't break in storms, she calibrated. During pre-flight checks, something snagged her attention again. Discrepancies in the maintenance logs. Small but dangerous, like a thread loose in a parachute. When she questioned the ground crew, they reassured her with that same practiced line. "It's all within parameters, Captain." But this time she didn't just nod. She ordered a full inspection, delaying departure by 20 minutes, an unforgivable offense in a system that valued punctuality over safety. "You sure that's necessary?" James asked gently, his voice not accusatory, but laced with worry. Maya looked at him, not blinking. Better to arrive late than never arrive at all. And if you've ever lived long enough to know the cost of silence, to know what it means to swallow your gut instinct because someone in authority told you it wasn't efficient, then you know the strength it takes to speak when the room wants quiet. That decision wasn't brave. It was responsible. Because professionalism isn't just following rules, it's knowing when to break the unspoken ones that endanger lives. The flight itself? Smooth. But the return to Chicago was met with tension so thick you could cut it with the edge of a reprimand. Barrett summoned her without pleasantries. "You delayed a flight," he began, not with a question but a charge. "Maintenance logs didn't match." "I followed protocol," Maya replied. He leaned in, voice low. "You don't have the authority to overrule ground staff on a feeling." She met his gaze, calm. "It wasn't a feeling. It was a mismatch between inspection records and system entries. That's a violation." He didn't deny it. He deflected. "You need to use better judgment." "Safety is my judgment," she replied, rising from her seat. "Always." And just like that, the game changed. Not because she yelled. Not because she threatened. But because she didn't flinch. And here's something worth remembering. Systems don't collapse when you push, they collapse when they realize you're not scared to speak. That night, Maya didn't go home and rest. She went home and worked. She laid out every log, every photo, every email. She pulled threads, connected dots, cross-referenced regulations with timelines. And somewhere between 2 a.m. and sunrise, she realized what she had wasn't just a hunch. It was a case, a real one, documented, labeled, bulletproof. She picked up her phone and called her sister Zoe. "I need you to connect me with your contact at the FAA," she said. "No hesitation, no second guessing. Because once you see the rot, you don't paint over the walls, you gut the house." The next morning, Maya made 2 calls before she ever stepped into the airport. One to the FAA. One to a journalist at the Chicago Tribune who specialized in corporate accountability. She didn't drop names. She dropped truth. Just enough to open the door. Just enough to make them look. At the pre-flight briefing for her next scheduled flight, the tone had changed. There were whispers, sidelong glances. Richard Whitmore stepped into the room, self-satisfied and smug. "There's been a change," he said. "I'll be taking command of this flight." Maya looked up. The forecast was clear. The weather was mild. No operational reason to be replaced. This wasn't about safety. This was about punishment. You're being reassigned to administrative duties, he added, handing her a temporary badge with access restrictions so tight she couldn't even reach the water fountain without clearance. Maya gathered her things with quiet dignity. Good flight, everyone, she said, stepping out. In the hallway, Lauren Kim, one of the flight attendants, caught up to her. It's not right, she whispered. You're being pushed out. Maya looked her in the eye. Then push back. Lauren hesitated, then pulled out her phone. I have photos from a flight last month. Cabin valve had a visible crack. They flew it anyway. Her hands trembled slightly. I've been keeping records. I just didn't know who would listen. Maya handed her a secure email address. I'm listening. And if you're reading this and you've spent your life wondering if keeping quiet keeps you safe, understand this. Silence might protect your job, but it will never protect your soul. So speak. Show up, even if your voice shakes, because the truth isn't loud, it's consistent. That day, Maya sat at her desk with limited access, her body present but her mind working in 4 directions at once. She received more texts, more emails, one from Peter Lawson, one from a janitor in maintenance, one from a retired flight engineer, all saying the same thing: it's been broken for a while. We just didn't know how to fix it. Maya didn't offer hope or false comfort. She offered a place to speak, a place to gather the pieces. And somewhere, in that sterile, silent room, a revolution quietly began filing itself into order. So if you ever think your role is too small, your action too quiet, your truth too inconvenient, think again. Change doesn't need permission. It only needs a starting point. And that starting point might be you. The door to the executive conference room clicked shut behind her like the closing of a vault. And for a brief second, the silence that followed felt heavier than any turbulence Maya Daniels had ever faced in a cockpit. The room was designed for intimidation: glass walls, polished oak, leather chairs that whispered power. But today, Maya didn't come to be impressed. She came to end the charade. At the head of the table sat Thomas Barrett, flanked by Richard Whitmore, Harold Wilson, and 2 men in suits who smelled like litigation and secrets. There were no pleasantries, no smiles, just tight faces and paper-thin patience. Captain Daniels, Barrett began, we have reason to believe you've been accessing restricted files and communicating with external parties regarding confidential matters. His tone was clipped, each word placed like a brick in a wall he hoped she'd be afraid to climb. Maya stood at the opposite end of the table, calm, unshaken. Do you have anything to say for yourself? He added, voice sharpening. She didn't sit. She didn't blink. Instead, she reached into her bag and placed a single manila folder on the table like a chess player moving her queen. Before I respond, she said evenly, you should know that this morning at 9 a.m., a report was submitted to the FAA outlining Meridian's systemic safety violations, including falsified maintenance records, retaliation against employees, and testimony from multiple staff across departments. The room froze. The suits exchanged glances. Wilson shifted in his seat. Barrett turned pale. You're bluffing, he snapped. Maya raised an eyebrow. A second copy was sent to the Chicago Tribune. And a third, she continued, is set to be released to every major aviation authority and news outlet in the event that anything happens to me or anyone who contributed. And just like that, the threat reversed. The hunted became the hunter. The power shifted not through volume, but through certainty. This was not a warning. This was a reckoning. If you think, Wilson growled, that blackmail will protect you. This isn't blackmail. Maya cut in, her voice soft but clear. This is accountability. And if you've ever sat in a room where people tried to silence you with procedure and policy, you know what she did in that moment. She refused to flinch. She refused to make herself small. Because the truth, when carried with courage, is heavier than any lie corporate power can carry. Barrett leaned forward, desperation breaking through his mask. What do you want? She didn't pause. I want every aircraft with maintenance irregularities grounded immediately. I want a third-party audit. I want written assurance that no employee will face retaliation. And I want your resignation, Mr. Barrett, along with Captain Whitmore's and Captain Wilson's. He laughed bitterly, the sound brittle and hollow. That would bankrupt the company. No, Maya replied. What bankrupts a company is knowingly putting lives at risk and hoping no one speaks up. That's the thing about systems built on silence. They look unshakable until one voice speaks with conviction. And then, they crumble like dry plaster. Barrett turned to his lawyers, who whispered and scribbled and eventually nodded. Defeated. We need time, he muttered. You have 1 hour, Maya said, turning to leave. After that, the full story goes public. As she stepped out of the room, her hands weren't trembling. Her breath was steady. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away after you've made the table shake. Over the next few days, the storm she'd unleashed took flight. Headlines blared across morning news. FAA investigators arrived with clipboards and cameras. Meridian grounded nearly 40% of its fleet. Passengers were stranded. Executives were suspended. And across the aviation industry, something unexpected happened. People started talking. Mechanics, flight attendants, junior pilots, ground crew, people who had been told to keep quiet or risk everything suddenly had proof that the truth could win. Maya became the face of that proof not because she sought attention, but because she earned it. If you've ever believed your best years were behind you, or that the fight was for someone younger, remember this: impact doesn't age. Wisdom is a weapon. Clarity is power. And truth, when spoken without fear, changes more than minds, it changes futures. So speak up. Even if your voice is soft. Even if you're outnumbered. Even if they tell you to sit down and smile. Because the sky doesn't care who you are, it only cares whether you fly straight. And Maya Daniels? She wasn't just flying. She was clearing the clouds for everyone coming behind her. 6 weeks later, Maya Daniels sat in a small cafe across from what used to be the Meridian Airlines headquarters, watching workers take down the company's iconic logo, piece by piece, like a monument to denial finally being dismantled in public daylight. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carries both endings and beginnings in its breath. Across from her, James slid into the seat, his tie slightly loosened, eyes brighter than she'd ever seen them. It's official, he said, breathless. Atlantic Airways is taking over the assets. They're offering to retain staff except, of course, the execs under investigation. Maya didn't say anything for a moment. She just watched the M come down from the building. A letter once meant to stand for prestige now lowered like a flag at half-mast. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives with a power drill and a quiet apology carved into corporate stone. She took a sip of coffee. And you? James nodded. They offered me a senior first officer track. It's a fresh start. Real one this time. Maya smiled not out of pride, but out of recognition. They were no longer surviving. They were choosing. That's a powerful difference. She had options, too. 3 major airlines had reached out. Safety organizations wanted her voice. A book agent had called. There was even talk of a documentary. But Maya hadn't said yes to anything yet. Because the choice wasn't just about what came next, it was about how to rebuild without repeating the very systems that fell. And that's something we, as a country, as people with years behind us and wisdom in our bones, need to remember. Change is not about replacing faces. It's about transforming foundations. When you've spent decades watching names change while injustice stays the same, you learn to look deeper. You learn to ask the hard questions, like, who is designing the cockpit? Who's checking the maintenance logs? Who's protecting the whistleblowers before they're needed? Maya had become more than a pilot. She had become the blueprint for reform. Atlantic Airways moved quickly. They implemented blind hiring procedures, no photos, no names, just qualifications. They created an independent safety board with full authority to ground any flight. And across the industry, other airlines followed, not out of charity, but out of fear. Fear that they'd be next. Sometimes it only takes one person to make an industry nervous enough to act. And if you've ever thought your truth was too small to matter, let this remind you. Systems don't change because they want to. They change because someone made it impossible for them not to. Maya didn't chase headlines. She chased integrity. She mentored young black pilots. She testified before Congress. And on the 5th anniversary of Meridian's collapse, she received an email. The sender? Richard Whitmore. The subject line read, "Apology." She opened it slowly, expecting excuses, but instead, it said, "Captain Daniels, I spent my life clinging to standards that excluded people like you. I was wrong. Your courage forced me to look in the mirror. The sky is safer because you refused to be silent. I hope one day you'll accept this apology." Maya sat with it a long time, not because she needed closure, but because she needed to decide if forgiveness meant forgetting. And it didn't. Forgiveness, in her world, meant remembering and still choosing not to carry the weight of someone else's shame. So she replied simply, "Apology accepted. The sky belongs to all of us." And maybe that's what this chapter of the story teaches us, especially those of us who've seen the world move through decades of false promises and slow progress. We must outgrow our bitterness, but never forget the blueprint of the fight. Maya didn't win because she shouted louder. She won because she documented everything. She knew her value. She called in help. She demanded better not just for herself, but for everyone strapped into a seat at 35,000 feet who had no idea the plane they were on was held together by silence and shortcuts. So if you've lived long enough to believe your story doesn't matter anymore, let this remind you, your experience is your evidence. Your years are your compass. Your voice? Still sharp, still needed. And your wisdom earned through every moment of quiet courage is still writing history. One truth at a time. 3 months later, as the morning sun cast gold across the runway at Chicago O'Hare, Maya Daniels sat in the cockpit of a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, her hands resting calmly on the yoke, the hum of the instruments like a heartbeat she had known all her life. The cabin behind her carried 243 passengers, each one with a destination, a story, a quiet faith that the person flying this plane knew what they were doing. And they were right. As the aircraft lifted into the sky, breaking through low clouds into open blue, Maya felt something she hadn't felt in years, not adrenaline, not relief, but peace. Because this time she wasn't just flying. She was leading from the front of a system she had once stood outside of, knocking on glass that refused to open. And now that glass was gone, replaced by sky. To her right sat First Officer Tasha Williams, a young black woman with sharp eyes, steady hands, and a voice that spoke with both reverence and readiness. As they reached cruising altitude, she turned slightly and said, "Captain, I just wanted to thank you. What you did at Meridian. It's the reason I'm still flying. When they told me I didn't belong, I remembered your name." Maya smiled not out of pride, but because she remembered what it felt like to hear someone say, "You're the reason I didn't give up." If you've ever mentored, guided, or simply refused to look away when injustice stood too loud, then you understand that moment. You don't need a medal to matter. You just need to keep the door open behind you. Maya's story had become more than a headline. It had become policy, training material, and boardroom conversation. Atlantic Airways appointed her as President of Operational Safety, the first black woman to hold the title at a major airline. But titles were never the goal. The goal was always impact. She advised federal oversight panels. She gave speeches not about heroism, but about accountability, about the cost of staying quiet, about how silence is often the co-pilot of disaster. And if you're reading this as someone who once stood down to keep the peace, know this: peace without justice is just another name for delay. So speak. Even now. Especially now. Years passed, and her quote, "The sky forgives many things, but it never forgives lies," was engraved outside training simulators and printed on flight manuals. But Maya didn't frame it on her wall. She carried it in her work. And when the Academy of Aviation Safety asked her to deliver the keynote at their national conference, she hesitated. Not out of doubt, but out of truth. She told them, "I didn't change the system from within. I broke it where it was failing and rebuilt it better." Because sometimes fixing a broken thing means tearing it down to the bolts. One spring morning, as she walked through the Atlantic terminal, she saw a group of young cadets in training, diverse, bright-eyed, ready. One paused to ask her for a photo. Another handed her a handwritten note. "Thank you for making space I could walk into." She folded it, placed it in her pocket, and whispered a promise to herself. Never let the room forget who was excluded from it. On the 5th anniversary of Meridian's collapse, an email arrived. The name stopped her. Richard Whitmore. The subject line read, "Reflection." Inside, the message was brief. "Captain Daniels, I thought I was defending tradition. I now see I was defending my comfort. You didn't just change the airline, you changed me. I'm sorry. I hope you continue leading with the same grace that forced me to grow." She read it once, then twice, and while forgiveness isn't a command, it is a choice. She typed back simply, "Apology accepted. The sky belongs to all of us." And perhaps that's where we end, not with a final landing, but with a reminder: history doesn't move in straight lines. It rises, it dips, it loops. And change doesn't come in waves, it comes in ripples, started by those brave enough to make the first splash. So if you've spent your years believing your best work is behind you, hear this: your voice still carries. Your values still matter. And the time to act is always now. Whether you're in the cockpit or the back row, whether you're retired or still clocking in, whether you're tired or still holding hope, don't underestimate the power of your truth spoken plainly. Because one woman said, "Wait outside," and another answered, "No," and from that refusal, an entire industry took flight in a new direction. Not because change fell from the sky, but because one pilot reached for it and never let go.